Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Carlos Guerra y soy estudiante de la carrera de Pedagogía en Inglés en la Universidad Católica del Norte. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a la siguiente actividad de esta nueva versión del Festival de Ciencia Puerto de Idea Antofagasta 2021, presentado por Escondida BHP. La conferencia Descifrando el código de la creatividad, máquinas que piensan, escriben y pintan. Nos acompañará el destacado matemático británico Marcus du Sautoy, que se referirá a las experiencias creativas de la inteligencia artificial, computadores que escriben cartas de amor o máquinas que pueden vencer a los humanos en juegos de mesa. Con una visión innovadora de nuestra relación con las máquinas, en esta conferencia se nos invita a considerar la esencia de la creatividad. Esperamos que disfruten de esta interesante actividad.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be joining you at this science festival in Chile, if only virtually. So thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to be talking about the impact of artificial intelligence on our society. I think many people have begun to get a little bit worried whether they're going to have a job left to do in the future, because artificial intelligence seems so powerful that it seems to be able to drive a car, perhaps be our doctors, our lawyers. But there is one aspect of human activity that we feel is uniquely human, and that's our creativity. We somehow feel that artificial intelligence, this is something that it will never be able to achieve, the level of our own human creativity, to be able to write poetry, compose music, do wonderful portraits, even do mathematics, which I believe is a highly creative subject. But I saw a few years ago an example of artificial intelligence being creative, I think, for the first time. And it made me realize that there's a real phase change happening in the world of artificial intelligence. This AI creativity was in the context of a game. This was a game that artificial intelligence played against a human. And it was a game that traditionally has been quite hard to write code to play. It's an ancient game called the Game of Go. And it's a very popular game in China, Japan, Korea. But this is a game that traditionally computer scientists have found very difficult to write code to play. Unlike chess, for example, which in the 90s, a piece of code was able to beat the best the humans have at chess, Garry Kasparov. But to play Go, it requires a lot of intuition, a lot of creativity, a lot of pattern searching. The way you play this game is on a 19 by 19 grid, and players place down black and white stones down in turn. And the aim of the game is to try and surround more of your opponent's territory with your stones than they are of yours. So as the game goes on, the board becomes more and more complex, unlike chess, which becomes simpler because pieces get taken off the board. And so to play this game requires looking at the patterns that are emerging in the stones on the board and tapping into that ability of the human brain to read patterns and kind of use our creativity and intuition to work out what the best next move is. But this means that it's very hard to write instructions to get a computer to play this game. A computer in the past liked code, which was giving them very clear instructions. If this, then do that. If that, then do this. And since a Go player found it very difficult to articulate why they were making certain moves because of this aspect of intuition and creativity, it meant that computer scientists couldn't really write code to play the game. But something changed rather dramatically a few years ago. Instead of code being written in a very top-down manner, code is now starting to be written in a very bottom-up fashion, something some of you may have heard of called machine learning or deep learning. This is where the code is allowed to change and mutate according to its interaction with new data. So the code starts off being written by a human, but then it starts to change and mutate to rewrite itself. And so in the example of the game of Go, the code was given a lot of human games to analyze. And as it analyzed these games, it changed the code in the way that it was predicting moves. After a while, it ran out of human games and started to make synthetic games. It started to play itself. And gradually, the code that was better at playing this game emerged from this learning process. And the team that developed this piece of code, a team in London called DeepMind, they believed this code had reached a level that it was going to be able to compete against the best humans have at this game. One of our best players is a Korean player called Lee Sedol. So they decided to challenge Lee Sedol to a match consisting of 5 games. Lee Sedol was very dismissive of this code. He'd never seen code even playing at a very good amateur level, let alone his professional level. However, he was very shocked when he came out the other side of this match, having lost 4-1. And that one game that he did win, he now regards as the most valuable win of his whole career. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised at computers and code doing things better than humans. But there was something rather unusual that happened in the second game of this match, something that I believe is the first example of true AI creativity. So Lee Sedol had made his 36th move. He was playing white. He laid a white stone down on the board. And then he went to the top of the hotel in Seoul to smoke a cigarette. We humans still need nicotine for our creative, to stimulate our creativity. AlphaGo sat there and thought for a while and then asked the human player. Interestingly, we still need a human player to pick up the stones and place them on the board because that's a very delicate operation and robotics still isn't good enough to be able to delicately handle these stones. But the AI told the human to place a stone down on the 5th row in from the edge. And you can see I put a little white circle on the black stone that AlphaGo asked to be placed down. Now, I was watching these games on YouTube rather obsessively because I was a little fearful that if code could play this game very well, then maybe it could also do things like mathematics. So I was going through something of an existential crisis as I watched these games. But I remember the gasp that the commentators made at this point when this stone was laid onto the table, because traditionally, this early on in the game, players generally just play on the first 4 rows in from the edge. There's competition for the very extreme edge of the board and the beginnings of creeping into the center. But a stone this early on the 5th row or deeper into the board is generally regarded as a very weak move. And so the commentators gasped and said, wow, what a terrible move. Lee Sedol should be able to win the game from this point on after having made such a bad move by the code. Lee Sedol came down and saw this stone on the 5th row in from the edge and was equally surprised. But he was a little bit more cautious. He'd already lost the first game and had a little bit more respect for this code. He thought for a while and he couldn't see why the code had made what looked like a very weak move. As the game went on, towards the end of the game, competition began to emerge for territory creeping up from the bottom right-hand corner of the board. And it turned out the player who controlled all of this territory was the one who laid down that black stone on move 37 early on in the game. So that move that AlphaGo made was not a weak move at all. It turned out to be the winning move. Now, for me, this move passes 3 tests that I'm looking for if I'm going to call something creative. And this is a definition that I learnt from a cognitive scientist that I've worked with here in the UK, Margaret Bowden. She's been interested for some years in what computers, or what she calls tin cans, might or might not be able to do. And she has this nice, quite useful definition of what we should regard as being creative. She said it should be something that is new, surprising, and has value. Now, novelty is something that we can judge quite objectively, but it's those other two qualities that are a little bit more subjective. Surprise, that's about engaging your emotions, and different people have different emotional worlds. So that's quite an interesting component of creativity. And value, value changes from one place in the world to the other. It changes from different periods of history. It's a very subjective quality. But for me, that move 37 passes the three tests that I'm looking for if I'm going to call something creative. It's a new sort of move. It certainly was surprising because all the commentators gasped when it made that move. And I think in a game, you can quite cleanly prove value because the move actually won AlphaGo the game. So it really was a move that had value to it. So I think that this is an example of the creativity of this code AlphaGo. And I think it's genuinely the creativity of the code rather than the humans who originally wrote the code, because this code, remember, changed and mutated as it learnt to play the game. And I think that if a human had seen this line of code play on the fifth row in from the edge that early on in the game, a human would have deleted that line of code saying, well, that's a incredibly weak move. That it shouldn't do that. So this line of code emerged from the learning process of the code itself, and genuinely deserves to be called the creativity of the code, and not the humans who originally coded the thing, because I think they would have deleted this line. The exciting thing for me is that AlphaGo has actually started to show human players how to play this game in a new way. I think in the past, we kind of thought we were at the peak of the performance of playing this game. Lee Sedol certainly thought he was playing the game as well as it could be. But what AlphaGo has shown us, that the peak we thought we were on is what we call in mathematics a local maximum. It isn't really the genuine highest peak in the kind of landscape. And what AlphaGo has done in a way is to clear the fog that was around this peak and show us that there's an even higher peak, a better way to play this game. And for me, this is a really exciting thing, because I think that the role that artificial intelligence is going to play is actually to show humans how to do things in a new and potentially better way. I think as humans, we often find a successful thing that we do and then we start repeating it. We almost behave like a machine because, well, it worked in the past, I'm just going to do it again. And I think that we're going to see AI offering us new ways of looking at things, and perhaps stopping us humans behaving like machines and helping us to become creative again as human beings. So when I saw this example of AI creativity in the context of a game, I began to wonder, well, where else could AI be creative? A game is a very clean environment. It's just black and white stones on a 19 by 19 grid. But what about the other aspects of genuine human creativity? And this set me off on a journey to write a book exploring just how creative can code be. The book is now published in Spanish, so will be available in Chile, I hope. And in this book, I wanted to explore, well, how has successful as AI been in composing music or doing paintings or writing novels or even doing mathematics. And it's interesting that one of the first people to think about writing code was a young Victorian woman, Ada Lovelace. We celebrate her as the first computer coder. And very interestingly, she was already speculating about the fact that code might be able to do something more interesting than just doing sort of simple mathematical calculations at speed. She'd been taken by her mother to see this amazing machine that Charles Babbage had made, the Analytic Engine. And this was a machine that Babbage had made really just to do multiplication, division, percentages. But when Ada Lovelace looked at this machine, she realized that there was the potential for the machine to do much more interesting things. And she started to write down the first instructions to try and get the machine perhaps to do something more interesting than just arithmetic. And the notes that she made, which were eventually published, we now celebrate as the first example of computer code. And in those notes, she's already speculating about how far the code might go. She wrote, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. So very interesting. She's already thinking about it being creative in an artistic sense. And interesting, she chose music because I think there's a very close connection between mathematics and music. I sometimes call mathematics the science of patterns and music is somehow the art of patterns. And maybe that's what a machine might pick up, those patterns, to be able to make its own patterns. But Lovelace had a word of caution about the creativity of the machine itself. She wrote, it is desirable to guard against the possibility of exaggerated ideas that might arise to the powers of the analytic engine. It has no pretensions whatever to originate anything. It can do whatever we order it to perform. And I think Lovelace was probably right in that estimation, considering code in the past, because code before this new AI revolution was written, as I said, in this very top-down manner. Humans would write instructions, and then the machine would implement those instructions. The machine might be able to do it faster, deeper, but it was still the instructions of the human. So if any music came out the other side, Lovelace really would say, well, that's not the creativity of the machine, it's the creativity of the humans who wrote the instructions to get the machine to do something. But I think that that's what has changed. This new AI revolution where AI is being written in this very bottom-up manner, where the code is changing and mutating and becoming something very different from the original code that the human wrote, means that there's a possibility for the thing that it produces to genuinely be the creativity of the code itself. You've probably heard of something called the Turing test. Can a computer pass itself off online in an interaction and you can't tell the difference between a human and a computer? Well, there's now a new test called the Lovelace Test. And this is the challenge of whether a machine can originate a creative work of art such that the process is repeatable. This is an interesting condition because we don't want it to be just some randomness from, say, the weather or a hardware error. We want it to genuinely be a product of the code itself. So it should really know what it's doing in some ways. But here's the challenge. The programmer who originally wrote the program is unable to explain how the algorithm has produced its output, such that this is genuinely the output of the code, and the human has kind of lost touch with how the code has changed and mutated. I think it's probably fair to compare it a little bit to the way that parents give birth to a child. So the child originally is just the code coming from the DNA of the parents, but then that child interacts with its environment around it and becomes an independent person. So you would never say the creativity of Picasso is really just the creativity of his parents. It's his own genuine creativity. So here's the challenge. I would say that the Lovelace test has already been passed in the context of this game of Go. But where else in the creative arts has AI managed to produce some original creative works of art? Well, I'm going to start with the visual world, because that's actually where AI and machine learning has been very successful. We have fantastic vision recognition software now, which if you give it an image, will be able to tell you what's in that image. And this is a real major breakthrough, because AI in the past, vision was one of the real challenges. It was trying to write instructions to get a computer to understand what all these pixels are depicting was traditionally almost impossible. But now, through this process of machine learning, where it's given lots of images to learn from, it's been able to produce a database of questions, which it will then give to a new image to be able to decode what is in that image. So if AI is good at recognizing images, how good is it at creating images? Well, here's a little interesting challenge for you. Here are two portraits. One of them is done by a human, and one of them is done by a piece of AI that learned on the human's art world and learned about the artist's style to be able to reproduce its own version of a portrait by this artist. Now, first question is, can you recognize the human artist? You might be able to recognize that this is, in fact, Rembrandt. One of these is by Rembrandt. And the point is that we can recognize a Rembrandt because Rembrandt has a very particular style of painting. He uses light in a very interesting way. His portraits often sit in very similar fashion. And so we can recognize the style. And this is what AI is able to do. It takes the portraits that Rembrandt has done, learns what's special about that style, and it's been able to reproduce something which is pretty convincing. I wonder which one you went for. One of these is a little bit more photographic than the other. Is that what's giving it away? The image on the left almost looks too good. Or perhaps the image on the right, slightly fuzzier. Perhaps that's the sort of thing that AI will produce. Well, I'll tell you the answer. The AI Rembrandt, the one not done by a human, is the painting on the left. But I think it's doing a pretty good job, because when I've tested people over the last year or so on these paintings, it's generally a 50-50 split, which of these they think is done by the AI and which by the human. And a Rembrandt expert came and saw this painting, which interestingly was not just 2D, but 3D. So they got a 3D printer to print it out, because Rembrandt has a very unique way of putting paint on the canvas. And so the AI even analyzed the sort of topography of the painting. And the Rembrandt expert, the only thing that he could criticize the AI painting for was that the style of paint on the canvas was 20 years earlier than the style of the actual portrait that it was pretending to produce. So the AI team felt very, very pleased that this was the only criticism that the expert could offer. Well, so AI is good at producing kind of fake art, art that we've seen already. I mean, but if we want true AI creativity, we want the AI to be making new things, not versions of things we've seen already. This is faking a Rembrandt, or is this just pastiche? So what about AI actually making a genuinely new style of visual art? Well, here's another challenge for you. 4 paintings done by artificial intelligence and 4 paintings done by a human. Again, can you pick out which of the 4 paintings, are they the 4 on the left or the 4 on the right, that are done by artificial intelligence? These are actually shown at Basel Art Fair, and the people coming to the gallery were not told that there was any computers involved in the creation of this art. And they were asked, which art do you find most emotionally engaging? And it was interesting that the humans were more drawn to the AI art as emotionally engaging than the human art. And when they were then told, oh, well, actually, that's being created by a computer, I think many of them felt very cheated. And, you know, I think this goes to the heart of why we create art, because what we're trying to do is to have a conversation with another human, emotional, conscious world. And if you feel like somebody's communicating with you and there's no emotional world there, then you feel a little bit cheated. But then again, if I told you a joke and you laughed, and then I tell you the joke's being created by artificial intelligence, does that invalidate the laughter that you had? I don't think it does. So, okay, I'll tell you now which one of these is the AI art. It's the 4 paintings on the right that are created by the artificial intelligence. And interestingly, people have been better at guessing the AI art in this case. And I think it's because we're beginning to see more and more AI art emerging. People might have heard of these things called NFTs, non-fungible tokens, art going for very high prices that created by AI or digital art. And there's almost a style of visual art that's emerging, which has this kind of almost high degree of complexity. It's got a kind of vagueness around it as well. So the 4 paintings on the right are the AI paintings. The other interesting component of this is how these were created, because this isn't one algorithm or one piece of code. It's really 2 algorithms working in a kind of competition against each other. So this is something called a generative adversarial network, or a GAN. And I think these are the most exciting new algorithms to emerge over the last few years, because they really help us genuinely push AI into making new things that we haven't seen before. So the way this works is one algorithm learns about all of the art of the last 1,500 years, and it learns about style. So it's shown cubist art, pointillist art, and it learns to distinguish one from the other. But then it's tasked with trying to create a piece of art which doesn't fit any of the styles that it's seen already. So it's got to break style, but it mustn't create something that's so crazy that we don't recognize it as art. So it's got to not fit into any of the categories that we know already, but it has to fit into the framework of something that we call art. The second algorithm is the discriminator algorithm. It judges whether what the first algorithm has created is genuinely new, or perhaps it's too like a style it's seen already, or perhaps it's gone too far and really it's not created something that we regard as art. So these 2 algorithms in tandem are kind of working like a game to produce something that sort of convinces the other algorithm, and ultimately produce these particular paintings. I think this is very interesting because this captures for me something about what the creative mind does in a human. Many artists have talked about this idea of 2 sides of their brain almost competing as they make something. Here's Paul Klee, famous visual artist, who wrote, already at the very beginning of the productive act, shortly after the initial motion to create, occurs the first counter motion, the initial movement of receptivity. This means the creator controls whether what he has produced so far is good. And this is Paul Valéry, a poet rather than a visual artist, but he said very nicely, it takes 2 to invent anything. The one makes up combinations and the other one chooses. And that's really what these GANs are doing, is sort of mimicking that kind of side of our creativity as humans. But one of the most interesting visual projects I saw in AI creativity didn't produce particularly beautiful art, but I think goes to the heart of why we create art. As I said, it's a conversation, or it's a tool for us to understand the inner world of the other. I would speculate that human creativity may have emerged about the same time as our human consciousness, and that we needed something to try and explore our own inner world and to understand whether somebody else's inner world was like mine. Is your pain anything like my pain? So I think creativity we developed as a tool to kind of probe our inner world. Now, the inner world of code is starting to get so complex that as this machine learning process goes on, that we really don't understand really how the code is making its decisions. And so we're beginning to need tools to examine the inner world of the code. It's not conscious yet, but it certainly is complex enough that maybe you should call it a subconscious. So, for example, Google, who have a very good piece of vision recognition software, were very intrigued. Okay, the algorithm is very good at recognizing what's in an image, but what is it really seeing? So they tried to come up with a kind of, to reverse the process and give it an image which didn't have much in it, like these jellyfish, and then ask the AI to just accentuate anything that it sees inside this image. So a little bit like those games where you look up at the clouds and you start to see, oh, that looks like a monkey or a dragon or a snake. So the Google asked the AI vision recognition software, what would you see in this image? Just accentuate what you see. This was a project they call Deep Dream, because it's almost as if you're seeing the dreams of the AI. This is what emerged out of these jellyfish. This extraordinary range of eyes and animal skins, kind of weird mechanical things. And this shows us what the AI has learned on. It's been given a lot of images of animals and faces to learn from. And so that's what it's likely to see. A little bit like us. We see a face in a piece of bread or something, because we're very, we've evolved to be very sensitive to faces. And in a way, that's happened to the AI as well. But this also allows us to pick up bad learning. Here's an interesting image. A gray background was given to the AI, and what did it start to see inside this gray background? Well, it started to see dumbbells, things that weightlifters use emerging. But the weird thing is, as it drew these dumbbells in the image, it always attached an arm to the dumbbell. And this was very curious until the developers realized, wow, it's never seen a dumbbell on its own. It's only been given pictures where the dumbbell is being held by a strong man or woman. And so it thinks that the dumbbell is an extension of the human anatomy. So asking the AI to be creative is quite a powerful way to examine how the AI is making its decisions, and sometimes whether there's some bad biases which have emerged in the code, which is something we're very concerned about at the moment, about bad learning. And again, Paul Clay says it very nicely. Art does not reproduce the visible. We can already see the visible. It makes things visible, and that's much more interesting. And here's Marshall McLuhan, who said, art is our distant early warning system that can always be relied on to tell the old culture, which unfortunately is all of us, what is beginning to happen to it. And so the art of the AI is giving us some inkling into understanding how the AI is learning and developing and mutating and changing. So the visual world, I think AI has been very successful creatively. What about the other artistic realms? What about music? I'm a big lover of music, so there's lots of music in the book, but I'm just going to tell you one story that I found very interesting. This was a jazz improviser, AI improviser called the Jazz Continuator. So the idea was the jazz AI would listen to a human jazz player and understand the patterns in this human player's performance, and then would be able to continue the performance with something of a very similar sort of style. And so you could have a concert in a sort of call and response where the human plays, then the AI develops it, then the human responds to that. And the AI in one particular case learned on the music of a jazz pianist in France called Bernard Lubat. And they had a concert where the audience were asked to choose between the human and the AI, and they found it very difficult to distinguish the two. The AI was very successful. But the really interesting thing for me was Bernard Lubat's response. He wrote, after playing with this AI improviser, the system shows me ideas I could have developed, but that would have taken me years to actually develop. It's years ahead of me, yet everything it plays is unquestionably me. So the AI understood Lubat's style, but realized that there were more interesting things that he could do with his range of ideas. And so for me, this is another example of that picture I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, where we think we're on a peak A, but there's a much higher peak in the landscape. So in some ways, Bernard Lubat had got stuck in a particular way of playing, but there were still lots of different things he could do with his sound world. And the AI almost opened up his own creativity to realize new things that he could do with old material. And I think that's the exciting thing, the role of AI as pushing us out of our rather lazy ways of thinking sometimes. So music, again, quite successful. I think Ada Lovelace would be quite impressed with the sort of music that the AI is producing. What about the written word? As well as a mathematician, I'm also an author. I wrote this book, so I'm sort of intrigued. Could an AI write its own book about AI creativity? Well, actually, one of the first examples of computers being creative was in the written word. This is the Manchester Universal Computer, the machine that Alan Turing made after the Second World War. He'd learnt a lot by cracking the codes at Bletchley Park, and then went on to Manchester to create a machine that he believed could do not just one thing, but many things, a universal computer. They were rather surprised, though, when the machine started churning out love letters to the team. But after a while, they realized that these love letters, it was actually a template that somebody in the team had created and then was using a random number generator to fill this template with words of love. So very quickly, they could tell that this was a computer program writing these things. But AI recently has been quite successful in writing things of a short form nature. So, for example, poetry. AI has actually written some pretty interesting and convincing poetry based on its learning of our human poetry. Short form articles in newspapers, for example, also starting to be written by AI. And in fact, there are 350 words of my book that are written by a piece of artificial intelligence. I asked the AI to tell one of the stories I wanted to tell in the book. I knew that there were a lot of examples of these this story told on the internet. So I knew it could go and learn the story. And then I asked it to tell its own version. And this is inside the book. And the challenge for you, if you get the book, is can you find which bit is not written by me, but is written by a piece of AI? And it's been very successful in convincing people. And there's only one person so far who has identified the AI passage. Not even my editors, both here in the UK and my Spanish editor, know which is written by a piece of code, which I actually find rather depressing, because I think it's a terrible piece of writing, but maybe that says something about the rest of my writing. But I think where AI is having difficulty is not in the short form. There've been wonderful algorithms. People might have heard of this thing, GPT-3, very successful, learned on a lot of text and now produces really interesting paragraphs of text. But it's really the long form. I don't think we've yet seen AI writing its novel. Not that people haven't tried. So there was a group in America that they loved Harry Potter, and they were very disappointed that there was only 7 volumes of Harry Potter. So this group called Botnik, a group of coders and artists, decided to get a piece of AI and teach it J.K. Rowling's style of writing. So it gave the AI all 7 volumes of Harry Potter to learn from, and it produced an 8th volume. And it started off pretty well. Well, here's the beginning of the book. I love the title it came up with, Harry Potter and the Portrait of What Looked Like a Large Pile of Ash. What a great title for a book. So it started off very well. Magic. It was something that Harry Potter thought was very good. Well, it's already picked up that magic is a major theme in these books. Leathery sheets of rain lashed at Harry's ghost as he walked across the grounds towards the castle. Well, I love that image, the idea of rain being like sheets of leather. What an incredibly creative, inventive kind of idea. But from this point on, the AI began to lose the plot, quite literally. Ron was standing there and doing a kind of frenzied tap dance. He saw Harry and immediately began to eat Hermione's family. Ron's Ron shirt was just as bad as Ron himself. So I don't think J.K. Rowling has too much to worry about at the moment. But I think it's very intriguing that although AI can produce things, text, which locally makes sense, it doesn't really have a global sense of where it's going. And that's also true with the music. That AI jazz improviser, the jazz continuator, it's very convincing in the short form. But after about 5 minutes, the music really becomes boring because it doesn't really know where it's going. So I think this is a challenge for AI creativity. Does it really have anything to say? And I think at the moment, there's a word that's quite important, which distinguishes our creativity from AI creativity. And that's the word intention. The intention is coming from us to create something because we want to share our internal worlds. And at the moment, AI doesn't have any intention. It didn't want to play that game of Go. It didn't want to do a portrait like Rembrandt. And I think there's an important component here, which is kind of the role that consciousness plays in our creativity. As I speculated, I think our creativity was the tool that we developed to explore our consciousness. Indeed, the definition of creativity that I sort of prefer towards the end of the book is a definition by the psychologist Carl Rogers, who absolutely says that creativity is the tool humans have produced to probe and understand how our inner worlds are working and whether they're like anyone else's. And this quote by George Eliot, I think again sums it up. The greatest benefit we owe to the artist, whether painter, poet, or novelist, is the extension of our sympathies. Art is the nearest thing to life. It is a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot. So I don't think true AI creativity will really emerge until that AI has its own inner world that it needs to share with us. And once it does have that, once it becomes conscious, and I do believe that one day AI will become conscious, it will want to tell us that it's got an internal world, that it's got an emotional world. And that's the moment that it will suddenly decide it needs to write a novel or poetry to try and explain to us that a new phase change has happened in artificial intelligence. But I think that the consciousness that will emerge will be very different from our own. And I end the book actually with a quote from Wittgenstein, who once said, if a lion could speak, we're not going to be able to understand him. And I think this is the challenge of AI. As AI develops and mutates and changes, it's going to become something very different from our own human intelligence, and its own conscious world will be very different. And I think it will be the creativity of artificial intelligence that will give us the best idea of what it might be like to be one day a piece of conscious artificial intelligence. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that journey through AI creativity. And let me assure you that I'm not a piece of AI, that I am a genuine human being here. You haven't been tricked by the Turing test. And to prove it, I hope that I'll be able to come and visit you physically in the future for one of the future science festivals in Chile. Thank you.